Welcome everybody, both those of you here in the room and those of you on Zoom. Hopefully the Zoom sound is working. Can someone wave if you can hear me so I know you can? Okay, good. Thank you very much. It's my great pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker, Jo Radner. Most of you know her, but there may be a few who don't, so it's my job to fill you in. Jo has deeper roots in this area than anyone else that I happen personally to know. Her mother's family came to Freiburg in the 18th century. Now that's a long time ago. Her grandfather was a teacher and he set up a boys' tutoring camp on Lower Bay on Keyser Lake in 1916, and that's where she lives to this day. And here's the real kicker. Her third cousin, twice removed, is the actual Charlotte Hobbs after whom this library is named. So in her professional life, Jo got her PhD from Harvard in Celtic languages and literature. Should I say Celtic languages and literature?
Both.
Okay, just checking. And then taught for 31 years at American University in Washington, D.C. But she is, amongst us here in Maine, particularly famous because she's quite an extraordinary storyteller. She says in one of her, something I read of hers, that she likes characters who shape admirable lives around unavoidable misfortunes. And she makes stories about people from here, from northern New England, although she does also perform traditional folk tales and things. Her major stories include Burnt Memory, which is a performance created from the oral histories of the Brownfield Fire in 1947, and Tangled Lives, Native People and English Settlers in Colonial New England. And she's also the past president of the National Storytelling Network and the American Folklore Society. So you can tell we're going to have a treat in store. So this evening, her talk is the same title as her new book, Wit and Wisdom in the New England Village Lyceum. And her talk is based on this work. She's going to tell you about it, but very, very briefly, just to set the scene. Before and after the Civil War, northern New England villages created weekly lyceums for which they would prepare formal debates on current or philosophical topics, kind of like this, actually. And their farmers and their sons and daughters would compose and read aloud homegrown literary newspapers. And that's what Jo is going to tell us about this evening. I have one practical thing before I hand over to Jo. Could you please all mute yourselves if you're joining us on Zoom? And if you have questions, could you hold them till the end? And if you're on Zoom, the best way to do it is to type them into the chat. And then at the end, we'll look at the chat and relay them to Jo. And if you're in the room, you can ask them in person at the end, and then Jo will repeat them so that those of you on Zoom can hear the questions before she answers them. And is there any other housekeeping things I should be doing, Jo, Dina? I think that's the important one for now. At the end, I'll say a couple of things about our next talk. Okay, so Jo, please, such a pleasure.
Thank you for that beautiful introduction, Moira. We will have a challenge this evening. It's fortunately technological, at least so far, and that's to the good. I am delighted to be here and to be here with you in person and on Zoom. And I want to say that I am going to be sharing my screen, not as well as I would like because we have had technical peculiarities already about that tonight. But I will be sharing my screen, and I will be sharing my screen showing some manuscripts. You won't be able to read the words. If they're important, I'll read them to you. But I really would like you to see the stuff I'm working with. So some of this is just showing you stuff. And don't worry if you can't quite get every little paleographical bit of it anyway. So before I begin, I do want to say that I do not forget that today I stand in western Maine on ground where my ancestors and the ancestors of the people I'll be talking about settled without purchase or treaty or permission 250 years ago. land that had been inhabited and cherished by the Western Abenaki people for many thousands of years. I inherit that responsibility, and frankly, I'm still working out how to deal with it. Now, the project I'm going to talk about tonight started entirely accidentally, with a discovery that opened up for me a huge window on life in this area and in all of 19th century northern New England. First, let's locate us. Here's where I'm going to try to share the screen. I'm apologizing in advance for the way it will look and hoping it will be visible.
Yes. Yeah.
All right. Now, I'm not going to try to make it full screen. It's not going to be what it ought to be, but it's going to be something that it can be. We're going to run 11 minutes late. All right. Thank you, Gilson. I think you did something helpful, and I haven't the faintest idea what, but I'm grateful. There it is. There it is. All right. Well, okay. All right. I think I said it began with an accidental discovery. We can't control these accidents, can we? So I want to start out by locating us. And I'm going to locate us this way. We have all driven past these connected farmsteads here in northern New England. Some of you live in them now. The farmsteads that have the big house, little house, back house, barn that Schooner Fair sang about and Tom Hubka wrote that wonderful book about. Those farmsteads were built, were constructed, were put together, were assembled in their connected form in the 19th century between the 1830s and about 1890. And tonight I'm going to peek into the life of the people who made them and lived in them at that time. My grandmother, my great-grandmother rather, grew up in this one, in Tollbridge, in Freiburg, where her family settled in the 18th century. Tollbridge, you know, is that area just south of the Lovell line, around the old course of the Saco. And family members still live in that house to this day. I'm very grateful to Diane Toll for sharing this particular picture with me for tonight. My great-grandmother, Maria Gordon, moved to Freiburg, to the village, to Main Street, a little after the turn of the 20th century. And then in 1886, I think, anyway, the mid-1880s, finally, we ran out of family members to live in that house in the village, and it fell to me to empty it so that it could be sold. It was a hard thing to do. You can imagine, I had to empty all the hundreds of years of furniture and stuff out, and I finally got to the attic in the summer. Now, if you've emptied an attic in Maine in the summer, you know that, well, you make discoveries, of course, but it's also sweltering hot, and it's full of stuff that a pack rat family has gathered, furniture, crockery, all kinds of things that people could neither throw away nor use, keys without locks, 100 years of pasteboard empty boxes that might come in handy someday, and in my family's attic, particularly paper, reams and reams of paper that people had written things on. And I was melting. So like a good pack rat descendant, I took all that paper and I piled it in boxes and I carried it down the stairs and stuffed it someplace else. And then, years later, searching for family history, I opened one of those boxes. And on top was a jumble of literary compositions in different handwritings. I saw The Afterglow, suggested by a sunset off Mount Kearsarge. The sun is descending low, and o'er the mountain heights streams a warm and crimson glow with a soft, rich purple light. It was just like that last night if you saw the sunset over Kearsarge. I was right there with it. And then the next piece of paper was headed Local Brevities. Mr. Fred Farrington, while in Saco recently, was mistaken for a member of the last legislature and arrested. He was charged with burglary, arson, conspiracy, embezzlement, sedition, and false pretenses. Diplomacy, history, politics hasn't changed a lot, has it? I decided Great Grandma Adams had had a kinky hobby. And then I turned other pages.
I'm so sorry. The papers are rustling into the speaker.
Sorry. Okay, thank you. So I turned to other pages. I found some doggerel alphabetical poetry. A is for the well-known Albion P, who thinks it's rather nice a county officer to be. B is for Barker, Frank, you know. With Miss May Ross, we think he will go. C is for Calvin, one who shaves staves, and his mind is all in a flurry about one octave. D is for Deacon and also for Dare, who went to snow the bridge and found Buzzle there. Well, I could tell these were sly jokes, but what were they about? Who were they about? Some of it was kind of interesting history, you know. Calvin who shaves staves, you know, back in the L perhaps of his connected farmhouse, he'd set up a workshop and he was making barrel staves to supply them to a barrel maker. That was good. And the deacon who went to snow the bridge. I bet you know what it meant to snow the bridge. A lot of people don't. But you know these covered bridges. Of course they had, this is the toll bridge, they had roofs on them to protect the wooden floors from rotting from wet. But in the wintertime, people weren't traveling on wheels. They were traveling on runners, on sleds and sleighs. And if you got to a bridge, you couldn't cross it unless someone had snowed it, had literally gone out and shoveled snow onto the bridge so you could go across it. So that was kind of interesting. Then I lifted another sheet of paper, and the pages kind of stuck together. And then I noticed that they were actually sewn together. Little bits at the left-hand side, you might be able to see, there's a little bit of string. And then as I looked more closely, there was some faint pencil writing in the middle of that sheet. And it said, Toll Bridge Journal, Volume 6, Number 3, March 12th, 1870. Tollbridge Journal. Huh. Well, there were no businesses in Tollbridge. There still aren't. There certainly was no newspaper. I looked again, and the whole thing didn't look at all like a newspaper, for that matter. It really didn't. Let me move this up to the top so it's out of your range. Does that work? Yes. It didn't look at all like a newspaper. It was tattered. And then when I lifted that tattered cover, I found the answer to what it was. Whoops, sorry, I'm having trouble moving things. There we go. Report of Last Lyceum said, the people assembled at the Tollbridge Schoolhouse last Saturday Eve in goodly numbers. I presume their object was to hear the eloquence of our Tollbridge debaters and listen to the able productions of Tollbridge contributors to the journal. Lyceum first. I'd heard of the American Lyceum, you know, those subscription lectures. People paid money in the cities and they went to hear Ralph Waldo Emerson or somebody else deliver a paid subscription lecture. This was obviously not that. This Lyceum evidently involved a debate by neighborhood people. Some of them were named further down in that description. And they involved listening to the journal. And it took place in the Tollbridge Schoolhouse, which was, of course, the only public building in the neighborhood. And not a very prepossessing public building, although many of you have seen it because it was taken to the Freiburg Fairgrounds, and it stands there now as the iconic one-room schoolhouse. This is what the interior of it looked like in the 19th century. The journal was produced by Tollbridge contributors, ordinary neighbors. And then next, and I turned the page again, there's a little tiny square of paper, said, "No certainty in hogs. We have for witnesses J.W.R. Farrington, Isaac Abbott, William G. Walker, Albion P. Gordon. All feel bad, but Ripley says they're not to blame." Next came 2 pages of a sincere moral essay in faint, spidery handwriting. Virtue. Virtue is a subject which deserves every man's attention. It consists in doing good and in speaking truth. The effects of it, therefore, are advantageous to all mankind and to oneself in particular. And it went on. And then in pencil on the back of the 2nd page of Virtue, there were 2 jokes. A man entered a printing office to beg a paper. "For," said he, "we like to read newspapers, but our neighbors are too stingy to take one." And then, "Do you retail things here?" remarks a boy to a clerk in a country store. "Yes, sir." "Well, retail my dog, then." On the next page, I spotted the handwriting of the Report of Last Lyceum author again. But this time he was turning his wit on the hog-raising topic. Notice, Dr. Franklin L. Hobbs would announce to the people of Tollbridge and vicinity that he will deliver a scientific lecture upon the subject of hogology at this schoolhouse on Monday evening next, commencing at 11:30 o'clock, and lecture 21 minutes precisely. During the lecture, the learned doctor will look and act out the hog as natural as life. Tickets, $5, which was a whopping sum. To any young man who will testify under oath at the door that he is paying his attentions to anyone with serious intentions of getting married and keeping a pig, a deduction of 3 cents will be made. Children, double price. And then it ends, "John F. Hobbs is respectfully requested not to be present as he might consider the lecture personal." Oh, this was esoteric. I certainly saw the bones of the joke, of course, but I knew that I was an outsider and this spoof was not intended for me. Several farmers had evidently experienced some trouble raising hogs, but I had no idea why this was funny. And I noticed the joke about John Hobbs, of course, Charlotte's father. Later on, I recognized that this whole thing was in John Hobbs's handwriting. He was a noted local wit, and he was actually making fun of himself in this piece. Well, next came something called Men's Vanity, another earnest essay arguing that men are even more vain than women with far less justification. And this was followed by Sam's Soliloquy, a homegrown poem about a courting disaster. "They say I went a-courtin'," this is verse 3, "they say I went a-courtin' and 'twas all the neighbors' talk, and very much to my surprise, the girls told me to walk. And walk I did, you better believe, and stop I never dare, and so kept on a-going till I tumbled down the stairs." And there was much more in it. I was beginning to think the whole hamlet of Tollbridge might have had a kinky hobby. Did other places have lyceums and have journals? Well, to cut the story completely short, they did. The Tollbridge Journal turned out to be the tiniest tip of a huge iceberg. 10 or 15 years of research and some fellowships and a lot of good luck and some help, and all of that brought me to see the broad picture of these rural village lyceums and their journals, which they called the papers. Pieces of the information were in 19th century regional journals. They were in the record books that the little lyceums kept. They were in diaries, letters, novels that have been justly forgotten. In the lyceum papers themselves, people loved to write about the things they did. So I'm going to quickly describe the whole lyceum phenomenon, which took place between the 1830s and the 1890s. This is an old map that I started to mark out some years ago, showing some of the lyceums with papers that I had found. If I now, it's Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont, the lyceum phenomenon was strongest in those 3 states and also some in rural Massachusetts. If I were now to put on that map a mark for every lyceum I had found, you wouldn't see the map, except maybe along the coast. Anyway, these lyceums took place in these areas only in the winter. Those long, long evenings when it gets dark at 4. And therefore they took place more or less between October and March. They were only in tiny little hamlets like Tollbridge, or there was one here in Lovell in number 4. Sumner Kimball wrote about it in his diary. And all those lyceums were part of a panoply of winter activities. People didn't just, go out and shovel the snow and go in and sit and mumble by the fire. They had a lot of social activities. They visited constantly. They had dances. They had intellectual things. They had spelling schools, which were essentially adult spelling bees that took place in the evenings in the schoolhouses. They had writing schools where traveling penmanship masters would come and help you improve your penmanship. They had singing schools where you'd learn to sing better in choral singing. But the intellectual pinnacle of all these activities was the local village lyceum. And they came about because young adults who had more time than anybody else in those evenings had the energy to get them up. They'd get together. The first thing they would do would be to buy a record book that they could keep minutes in and write a constitution in. They loved to write constitutions. I'll give you a sample of the preamble of the Constitution from the Lyceum of South Ackworth, New Hampshire. Whereas the general diffusion of intelligence is of vital importance, and whereas it is the surest safeguard of republican principles and the most efficient means for the suppression of vice, error, and crime, and whereas we, the citizens of South Ackworth, believe there is no way better calculated to preserve such results than by an interchange of sentiments and opinions, we do therefore agree to form ourselves into a society, the object of which shall be the improvement of the various faculties of the mind. This is serious language, and they meant it. Face-to-face discussion mattered as a way to educate yourself. People all over New England were bent on educating themselves. Beyond the common school, self-education was a kind of rule. The common school was the preparation for lifelong learning for these farmers and their families and their neighbors. Here's a piece from a lyceum paper from Landaff, New Hampshire. How to Educate Oneself. The idea that schools are indispensable in acquiring knowledge is without foundation. All persons, however situated, may gain wisdom and knowledge every day, may add new treasures to the intellect as often as earth revolves. If any would educate themselves, they must be dependent on no teacher, minister, doctor, or lawyer, but must be all of these to themselves. And that's what the neighbors were out to do in creating and supporting these little winter lyceums. As I talk, bear in mind that serious purpose and also the humor, the wisdom and the wit, because both of them were necessary as they felt. So these things took place usually weekly and usually in the local schoolhouse, which was non-sectarian and had no political connection. Good neutral place. the central activity was a debate. The debaters, 2 men on the affirmative, 2 men on the negative. It was always men, except later in the century there were a few women. They were appointed a week in advance, and then they would come, they would prepare. Debating was very popular in the 19th century, particularly in New England, but elsewhere as well. Here's a popular guide to how to do it, and you can see in the picture the debater presenting his argument to the president of the Lyceum with a rapt audience behind him. They debated a lot of different topics. More than half of the topics of these debates in these little farm villages were matters of national policy. These people were very well read of the newspapers. They debated the abolition of slavery, they debated capital punishment, women's suffrage, immigration. They also dealt with philosophical matters. Is ambition a vice or a virtue? Is novel reading injurious to the mind and morals? And they dealt with historical matters. One of my favorites is, was Columbus, the discoverer of America, a greater hero than Washington, its defender? And another one that absolutely fascinates me, has America done greater harm to Indians or to Africans? That amazed me. So the debaters got up and presented their arguments, and then the matter was thrown open to the audience, and people volunteered with their ideas. At the end, they were judged, either by a vote of the audience or by a team of judges, which also often included women. Apart from the debates, a lot of other things could happen at the Lyceum. The principal one was the paper. The paper is usually mentioned in the Constitution as a necessary part of the Lyceum. But there was also music. Sometimes people gave a song. Sometimes an elder would give a lecture. There would be a dialogue recited, or girls would recite poetry. Boys would recite a kind of martial or military declamation. You can get the idea of the speeches the boys gave from this picture on the anthology. And a whole range of participants crowded into that little schoolroom. It wasn't just young adults. There was everybody there, from the older common school pupils to farmers, their wives and families, to local mechanics, that is, craftspeople, wagon makers, carpenters, and so on, and also the local intelligentsia, the lawyer, the doctor, the minister, the teacher, small group. And the general shape of the evening started out with men's voices. The president would welcome the assembly. The secretary, also a man, would read the minutes of the last meeting. But very often the last activity in the evening came in a woman's voice, and that was the reading of the paper. The editor, or as she was sometimes called, the editress of the paper, was very often a woman. And the editor's job was very, very complicated. First of all, the editress was chosen the week in advance, like the debaters. And then her job was to make sure that the neighbors gave her their own literary compositions that they wrote for the paper. And then she selected the pieces she'd gotten and arranged them in order, wrote more of them if she didn't have enough, wrote an editorial, and then made a fair copy of it in her own handwriting so that it was legible. After I'd seen enough of these papers, I realized that that little piece of the Tollbridge Journal that I'd found was not typical. I think that was something my great-grandmother, those were the pieces she had collected and arranged. They were all in different handwritings. You couldn't stand up and, oh, by the way, I brought it, if you'd like very carefully to see it at the end. If you're here, you're welcome to look at it. You couldn't stand up and present it because it would fall apart, but she had arranged it and was going to copy it. This is what a paper typically looked like. I'm going to show you very quickly 5 sheets of Mary Batchelder, the editress of the Kearsarge Fountain in 1850 in East Andover, New Hampshire. This is a paper that she wrote. Here's the cover sheet. You can see it's all in her hand. Then the next page, she's arranged it in 2 columns. Some poetry also in her hand, more prose, and then finally her editorial. Mary Batchelder was very unusual among editors because she kept some of the papers that she wrote, that she edited. Most of the papers were just thrown away. If you can think of how many hundreds of lyceums there were in northern New England, in Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont, and Massachusetts, between 1830 and 1890, and how many thousands of papers there must have been, a different one each week, I have found in 20 years 70 examples. So, they were only there to be performed. They weren't important as text, they were important as event, and that seems to me very important. So the editor had power and responsibility, could pick all these things. And with that power and responsibility came tribulations. First of all, the editor had to persuade the neighbors to write. Here's an editorial in the Antrim, New Hampshire Literary News. It is now 1886, and we suppose, as you have all commenced the new year with many new resolutions, I hope that none of you will forget to make one for the Literary News. That as for you, in the future, you will try and write a piece for our paper. The editors wrote prose, they wrote poetry, they wrote biblical parody about their difficulties gathering submissions. Here's one from West Plymouth. Yeah, writer's block is not new. From West Plymouth, New Hampshire. 'Twas the night before Lyceum, when all through the house not a creature was stirring, not even a mouse. An editress sat all alone in her chair in hopes that contributors soon would be there. And the contributors, when they did write, were often hesitant. I found this penciled note on a toll bridge submission. Dear Miss Adams, herewith find something for the paper which I trust may be suitable. If you can't read it, send it back, and I will hang it up in the cornfield this summer to scare crows. But many people did overcome their fears and wrote for their papers. And then, of course, the editor had to create a paper that would engage a schoolhouse full of people, from schoolboys, older schoolboys, to farmers, to the minister, and all of that. And they were all listening. You can't skim through something you're listening to. You have to hear every word. It wasn't easy to create a paper to hold everybody's attention. George Emery, who edited the Kearsarge Fountain in December 19th, 1849, wrote about his view of the paper, and what he said is echoed by many other editors. Many complain that our papers contain too much nonsense, some that they're too sober, not spicy enough, and almost every person will find some fault. The papers had to be a jumble of contents, wit and wisdom, like the New England weather, if you don't like it, just wait a minute. And reading aloud in the Lyceum was a stretch, especially for women. Women were keyed as the readers in the 19th century. They did a lot of reading. Up here, in northern New England, practically 100% literacy among women. But the kind of reading that they normally did was domestic. Like this little scene here, where there's a woman with her book on her lap and her attentive children and her approving husband listening to the domestic scene. It was very different in the Lyceum. You had an audience of men and women. They were not in the family immediately. And people judged the quality of the readers. On January 29th, 1866, Mary Frances Hodgson of North Waterford wrote in her diary, Mrs. J.B. Rand presented the paper. It was not very well read, but there were some good articles in it. And then 3 weeks later, she wrote this in her diary. I presented the paper. I didn't break down, but failed to satisfy myself in reading. You know, think about it, the paper was the only Lyceum activity that every attendee was asked to contribute to. The reader had to capture every voice, you know, had to catch each tone in this deliberately jumbled mass of pieces and, you know, sort of present the collective conversation. It's not easy. So imagine the scene. As the editor and the editress read the paper at the end of the evening, the audience sitting on those rough benches, and there would have been another set of benches on the opposite sides, so the people were looking at each other, actually. And the president would have been up forward where the teacher would have been during the school, near the blackboard, and the speaker might have been up there too, reading. And people were looking at each other, wondering, because all the pieces in the paper were anonymous. So they were sitting there looking around and speculating. If only the editor knew who had written anything. That's power. That's power. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen at the risk of not being able to do that again. And I want to talk a little bit about the papers. All the papers had some serious contents. They had moral essays and poetry, things like Men's Vanity or The Duties of Youth, The Influence of Bad Habits. They wrote about the brevity of life, about death, about how the beauty of nature bespoke the presence of God. These papers came from a community that shared values and believed that was so important that they had to acknowledge it all the time. They also had serious concern with regional and national issues. They wrote about temperance, about the value of farming, about the gold rush, about slavery. These were people who were well informed. And they loved their area and their way of life. They wrote celebratory poems about local loggers who were serving the world. They wrote about loving the Lyceum and about how wonderful their own village was. But all of this was surrounded by humor. They wrote satires, jokes, puns, teasing riddles, parodies of journalistic genres and political oratory, comic poems, mock biblical prophecies and narratives. In fact, particularly devastating, I think, forged selections from diaries of members of the Lyceum. But apart from generic jokes like, you know, retail my dog, that kind of thing, they really wrote original literature, all of it. No farmer's blunder, no prank could escape public notice. Bungling, could inspire flights of imagination. I finally figured out the events that lay behind the Tollbridge Journal's many articles about hogs. Turns out that some prominent Freiburg farmers, who should have known better, took bad advice from a neighbor and purchased some diseased hogs that subsequently died. You know, that's the kind of situation that could lead to festering feelings in a small community. You know, bad gossip. But instead, the inventive Lyceum paper writers took the occasion as a literary inspiration. And they came forward with several strategically scattered and very different teasing pieces that were read aloud to the whole neighborhood. There was first that brief news item, remember, the no certainty in hogs. And then there was John Hobbes's notice of a forthcoming scientific lecture upon the subject of hogology. Then there was a long mock biblical epistle of John to the people of Tollbridge, narrating the melancholy history whereby was fulfilled the prophecy, the desolation of the pig pen spoken of by the prophet John Hobbes again, I'm sure. And then there was a mock recipe for soap making that made fun of the economics of buying a sick pig solely so when it died you could try out its lard. Well, the hog scandal was not news to the Lyceum members. The whole neighborhood already knew about it, which which reminds me of a saying I've heard attributed to Stephen King, that why people read local newspapers, not to find out what happened, but to find out who got caught at it. Well, this wasn't a matter of being caught, actually, but it was a matter of becoming literature. This community, all these little Lyceum communities were close enough that people had to be able to take a joke. And the people took the jokes to blunt the sting of gossip. It was about preserving community, I believe. So the most common topic of humor was, of course, then and now, relations between the sexes. Several of the papers report married men caught in compromising situations. The most extended account that I have found is in the South Bethel Gazette of 1889, headlined "A Startling Incident." It reports an unsuccessful attempt of a prominent citizen to elope with a married lady. Mr. Abbott's unusual behavior had given his wife premonitions. Once she reported he actually hung up his hat when he came into the house. He'd never done that before, and she knew something was wrong. But finally, the wicked man left home as if he was going to a meeting, but he actually picked up one Mrs. Goodwin in his wagon and made off with her. And here's the piece. I just have to read it to you because it's luscious. When halfway to Bethel Hill Corner, the horse became frightened at something by the roadside, and Mr. Abbott, being unable to restrain him, having only one hand not engaged, they were both thrown violently from the wagon, and the horse, freeing himself from the shafts, ran home. A passerby soon noticed the mishap and set about to release the unfortunate couple, who were struggling to regain their equilibrium, but were unsuccessful, as the wagon and its contents were topmost. Upon finding herself free, the lady took to her heels, leaving only one thing that betrayed her identity. This was a dental plate set with 2 teeth in front, which were thrown from her mouth at the time of the disaster. Mr. Abbott was injured about the skull and has slowly been recovering his senses ever since, much to the satisfaction of his wife. It is stated upon good authority that as there was a box of eggs in the wagon, the unhappy pair presented a striking symphony in yellow at the time of rescue. This is the second mishap Mr. A has experienced in trying to manage the horse with his dexter hand. Moral: don't try to do 2 things at once. What can I say? As far as I can tell, both parties, Mr. Abbott and Mrs. Goodwin, were real-life, current members of the South Bethel community, and each of them had been married to other people for about 3 years. I'll never recapture what the spoof was, but I love the writing. Can you imagine these people had gone to 8th grade? It was a different era. So events these juicy are pretty rare. But since the young unmarried adults were the ones who supported the Lyceums most vigorously, romance bulks very large in the papers. Teasing about young people's hopes and crushes, their successes and failures at courting, the fortunes and the misfortunes of marriage, and the tribulations of bachelorhood. Here are some samples, and notice how they loved to play with newspaper language. That was another of their literary models. From West Plymouth, New Hampshire, marriages. The upright, notorious Frank Morse and the surpassingly beautiful Florence Field were united in the holy bonds of door lock. The poor fellow had to walk home in the rain, saying it was the first time she ever turned the key on him. She would never have a chance to do it again. Or from East Cabot, Vermont, Lost. A very small pasteboard box containing a pinch of ashes. This being all that remains of a true heart, devoured by the flame of love, kindled by that false-hearted lass, Hattie Gilman. Any person finding the same will please return it to its owner, Will Abbott. And then finally from Sweden, Maine, answers to correspondence. Stevie Sawyer wishes to know what he shall do when the girls will not let him go home with them. We would advise him to go home alone. Well, the papers broadcast rumors about who was sweet on whom to a huge variety of genres. Riddles, versified mock wills, alphabetical verses. My favorite are shipping news. All of these villages were inland. There was no shipping. The ships had the names of local women and the captains of local men, and sometimes the captains swap ships. It's quite interesting. So imagine the joy of hearing these things in that crowded schoolroom. Sharp-eyed authors watching for victims here and there, Nervous youths waiting to see if somebody smiles or blushes. Everybody guessing who had written what. So what's going on with all this funny business? And how does it fit into those goals that the Lyceum founders had of, the general diffusion of intelligence, the improvement of the mind, suppressing vice, error, and crime? Well, humor depends on social situations. And this humor, I think, can be a window into the society of our ancestors in this area. Think about the 19th century in northern New England. It was a period of tremendous economic change. There was farm produce flooding in from the Midwest, even cheaper than what could be grown right here. Mass manufacturing was displacing the home industry that everybody counted on, shaving staves in your back L. There was a lot of challenge to the traditional ideals of family farming in this area. Young people couldn't stand the hardscrabble, worn-out farms, and they were leaving for the cities or for the West where the fields didn't grow rocks the way they do around here. These kinds of villages were depopulating very fast at a time when the population of the United States was doubling. It was dramatic. And these papers present the rarely heard voices of people who were facing those pressures, people who wanted their traditional way of life, thought it was superior to what was new, and dearly wanted to preserve it. So take the humor about courting. The message was always, marry soon, don't be a flirt, and marry local, preserve our village. Hence all the teasing about possible local partners. Women who were attracted to the sophistication of the cities were warned off. Here's a piece from Veazey up near Bangor, advising Veazey girls to stop simpering or playing the fool to some brainless mustached fox in the parlor. Better set your cap for that young farmer or river driver at whom you have nearly died a-laughing so many times. Go to work and be no longer the contempt of all the smart, active, go-ahead, marriageable young men in Veazey. Preserve our village. And also improve your mind to become a responsible citizen by taking part in the Lyceum. Write for the paper. Write anything, even a joke at first. Someone in Kentuskeg in a Lyceum paper said, thought engenders thought. Place one idea upon paper, another will follow it, and still another, until you have written a page. At first, your ideas may come in lumps, homely and shapeless, but no matter. Time and perseverance will arrange and refine them. Which is not bad advice even today, I tell you, as one who has procrastinated writing a book for 20 years. But it wasn't just writing for the paper that mattered. It was taking part in the whole Lyceum. And I'm going to try and do the risky thing here again. Share the screen. There it is. We're back. All right. People absolutely loved their lyceums as neighborhood communities. This is the closing poem in the South Levant, Maine Independent in March of 1881. And it's a poem that describes the whole Lyceum, and I'm just going to give you a few bits of it for the spirit of it. I'm going to start with the third stanza. And here, on winter evenings bright, we've met on each successive Wednesday night for good and fun combined. I fear 'twas oftener fun we came to find. However, that is only boyish nature. Read and speak and hear the paper. And as we've listened to some sharp bit of pointed scorn or youthful wit, we've laughed to see the faces change and shrink beyond our vision's range. But when they joked us in our turn, with silent rage, our face would burn. I'm going to skip down to the very last stanza of the poem. When time has left its blighting trace on this dear and hallowed place, then whene'er the Grand Master may call us away from the trials and troubles of life's fleeting day, from the reading club on earth which our hearts dearly love, may we all meet at last in the grand club above. The Lyceum is a foretaste of heaven. And they knew what heaven looked like, very clear. And I realized why I love the papers especially in the Lyceums. The papers intensified this sense of community. They were the only Lyceum activity in which everyone took part. The single voice of the reading editor was a true community voice, and it gave back to the Lyceum as a whole an oral image of itself, multiple but united. The Lyceums, as I said earlier, took place all over inland northern New England between the 1830s and the 1890s. And at the same time and in the very same area, and by the very same people, those connected farmsteads were being created. This is the map that Tom Hubble created for his book, Big House, Little House, Back House, Barn. And it shows the major regions where you find those connected long farmsteads in northern New England. And it is spot on, both in time and in demographics, with what was going on in the Lyceums. So as I drive by these long, graceful old farmhouses today throughout this countryside, I think of the people who made and lived in them. I think how the same devotion to improvement and practicality shines through their buildings and through their Lyceums. I think how the different units of those farm buildings, ingeniously connected, unified the disparate activities that sustained the farm families. And I think just as the Lyceums and their papers brought together disparate members of the community and united their varied literary interests and abilities. I think how individual and asymmetrical and yet conventional the farmsteads and papers were. And I think of how the makers of those connected farms and of the Lyceums cared about a kind of classical beauty in architecture and in literature. And finally, I think of the powerful but always precarious ideal of democracy and individual responsibility that our ancestors were modeling. And that's it. And now I see we have more than one screen of people. I welcome all of the people who are on Zoom, and I welcome again everyone who's here together with me in this room. And I'd very much like to hear if you have any questions or comments.
Joe, you have 18 possible questions in the chat. Would you like to start with questions in the room and then do those in chat? Or?
Yes, I think Dina Wilson at the back has the chat. And why don't we see if there are questions in the room and we can alternate. And we can't answer all the questions because we already started late because of technical difficulties. But sure. Does anyone here have a comment or a question?
I'm just wondering where we can get your book.
Thank you very much. Jean Eastman just asked where they could get my book. I did turn the pandemic into a writing retreat. I had postponed writing the book for 20 years. I was one of those things where I said, I'll write it someday when I have nothing else to do, thinking that would never happen. But I'm looking for a publisher. I'll let you know. I hope it will be out. Thank you. Moira.
I'm curious as to the size of these communities. I mean, and are they meeting every week? And how many people are there potentially contributing?
Curious about the size of the communities. Are they meeting every week? And how many people are potentially contributing? Well, it's very difficult to say the size because these are hamlets within towns. So you can't say what I can't say, the population of number 4 in Lovell or the population of Toll Bridge in Freiburg very precisely. But what I can say is that the basic population of the Lyceum was the neighborhood of the one-room school. However, people traveled even 20 miles, as much as 20 miles, to visit other lyceums in other neighborhoods. They didn't meet all the time. One community would start one season. They might start it in December and run it through March, weekly. And the next season, somebody else might start a temperance league, and there weren't enough people in the neighborhood to maintain both, and so they'd have that for a while. But they traveled around to each other's lyceums, and obviously not everyone wrote because people had writing blocks, but there are descriptions that say that the schoolhouses were crowded often. So they were popular as long as the weather wasn't too bad. Even if the weather was too bad, my great-grandmother, whose diaries I found, would say, not many at Lyceum tonight, blizzard. You know? Thank you. How about something from the Zoom? Do we have a question from the chat that makes sense?
Ricky Saltzman asked Joe, did the editor/editress sometimes eliminate contributions, or was there no way for you to determine this?
The question is, did the editor or editress ever eliminate contributions, or can I not tell? Well, of course, I don't have the original batch of contributions that any editress had, but I do know that I've read comments. One editress in a paper said, I've included everything that was suitable and not too long. But the most common lament is that there are not enough contributions and that the editor has to write a lot to make up for it. And sometimes they borrowed published things, although when they did that, they did it just the way they took their neighbors' writings. They submitted them anonymously with no attribution, and they adapted them to the neighborhood. So they'd put in local names, even if it violated poetic meter, and so on, to make it relevant for the community. Is there another one from this chat?
How many people could fit into the schoolhouses? Did they meet outside in the summer?
Oh my goodness, how many people could fit into the schoolhouses? I'm sorry, what was the last part of that?
Did they meet in the summer?
Did they meet in the summer? No, these met only in the winter. Unlike the Chautauquas, which had a very different kind of resonance and did meet in the summers as educational activities later in the century, thank you. Later in the century, the lyceums, the village lyceums, were only on those winter evenings. I don't know. Schoolhouses varied in size. You probably could pack 50 to 100 people in them if you needed to. they'd be packed. Anything else? Let's take a couple more and then.
Were any of the minutes of meetings preserved?
Yes, were any of the minutes of the meetings preserved? In fact, that's what you can find. The lyceums tended to purchase a little hardbacked bound notebook in which the secretaries, and they alternated too, faithfully recorded the minutes. Who spoke, what the topic of the debate was, who argued the affirmative, who argued the negative, who read the paper. They never say anything about what was said in the debate or about what was written in the paper. No comments, but there are minutes in the classic style that we all know of minutes. So those are preserved much more than the paper because they're more visible and they tend to crop up in historical archives. It's harder to find papers, partly because, as I said before, they were disposable. They were meant just to be read, and then unless the editor kept it, there were no lyceum archives. No one kept them. They might have, gone to serve their next function in the privy. I don't know. But the record books have come down to us, quite a few of them, and they are in archives and historical museums and societies. Yeah. Another one, a last question. Anyone here? Anyone there? Okay, one last question.
Were the writings similar to letters to the editor in today's papers?
Were the writings similar to letters to the editor in today's papers? Well, there were some things that were letters to the editor, and those imitated the style of letters to the editor in the contemporary regional newspapers. But the styles varied enormously, from little jokes and, why does Henry bring a fan to Lyceum, with a capital F, meaning her name was Franny or Fanny, and, They loved puns and wordplay, but everything goes from that to rather elegant things, beautifully written things like the piece I read about Mr. Abbott's abduction, elopement, to very, very much less elegant doggerel poetry. There's no way to generalize about the style except to say that these people were so well read. In childhood, they read, children's nursery rhymes, all kinds of children's literature, the school readers, which they pored over and read very closely. Everyone read the Bible, and then they went on to read almanacs, gift books, fiction, all the local newspapers, the regional newspapers, and some kinds of legal documents, so they could imitate those. There are spoof wills, which are quite funny. They had dozens and dozens of genre models. Well, I want to thank you very much for coming and for putting up with this peculiar situation of the Zoom sharing. I hope you were able to see the illustrations at any rate, and thank you for your support.
Thank you so much, Joe. It was just wonderful, fantastic. I knew nothing about this, so it opened my eyes. Before you all go, I just want to tell you that we have one more talk left in our summer speaker series, and it's on Monday, not on Thursday. It's Zoom only. It's joint with the Casco Library and the Greater Lovell Land Trust, and it's called Zero Waste by Julie Olsen, and it's about how she reduced her trash to practically zero, and advice how we can all do the same thing. And I believe it's at 6:30, and the posters for it are up around town. Although it's the last of our summer speaker series, we will be starting a year-round fall and winter speaker series, not every week, it'll be more like once a month. And there'll be one starting in late September. So watch this space as soon as the program is announced, which will be, I think, in a probably in a couple of weeks. It'll be on the library website, and then each talk will be individually organised. But anyway, next Monday. So for today, just to thank Joe one last time, so terrific. And thank all of you on Zoom who joined us tonight, and those of you who came.